Captain Rebecca Mitchell gripped the controls of her vintage P-51 Mustang, the same aircraft her grandfather had flown over the Pacific in 1943. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Nevada desert as she prepared for what should have been a routine flight demonstration at the annual Thunderbirds Air Show. The restored warbird hummed beneath her, its Merlin engine purring with the same power that had once escorted bombers deep into enemy territory. Rebecca had spent 3 years meticulously restoring this particular Mustang, working nights and weekends in her hangar after her shifts as a commercial airline pilot. Every rivet, every wire, every component had been carefully sourced and installed with reverence for the aircraft's storied past. The plane bore the original nose art from her grandfather's squadron, complete with the faded yellow and black checkered pattern that had struck fear into the hearts of enemy pilots decades ago. Colonel James Harrison, the air show coordinator, had initially welcomed Rebecca's participation with enthusiasm. Her credentials were impeccable: 15 years of commercial aviation experience, advanced aerobatic training, and a family legacy that commanded respect in aviation circles. The Mustang had passed every safety inspection with flying colors, and Rebecca's demonstration routine had been approved months in advance. But everything changed when Harrison discovered that Rebecca's grandfather, Captain Thomas Mitchell, had been court-martialed in 1945 for allegedly abandoning his formation during a critical bombing mission over Japan. The charges had been quietly dropped after the war ended, but the stain on the family name had never fully faded. Military records showed that Thomas had actually diverted to protect a damaged bomber, saving 12 crew members' lives. But Harrison chose to focus on the initial accusations rather than the heroic truth. 3 days before the air show, Harrison summoned Rebecca to his office. The sterile military environment felt oppressive as he delivered his ultimatum: withdraw from the demonstration or face public humiliation, when he announced her grandfather's cowardice over the loudspeaker during her flight. He claimed that allowing a traitor's granddaughter to fly would dishonor the memory of true heroes. Rebecca's hands trembled with rage as she listened to Harrison's threats. She had spent her entire life honoring her grandfather's memory, knowing the real story of his bravery from family letters and witness accounts that had never made it into official records. The idea of surrendering to Harrison's blackmail felt like betraying everything her grandfather had fought for. That evening, Rebecca sat in her hangar, staring at the Mustang's polished aluminum skin. The plane seemed to whisper stories of courage and sacrifice, of pilots who had faced impossible odds with unwavering determination. She thought about her grandfather's final letter to her grandmother, written just days before his death in a training accident in 1946. In it, he had written about the importance of standing up for what was right, even when the world seemed determined to tear you down. Rebecca made her decision. She would fly. The next morning brought unexpected complications. As Rebecca taxied her Mustang toward the runway, she noticed an unusual formation of modern F-35 Lightning II fighters circling the airfield. The sleek, angular jets seemed almost alien compared to her vintage Warbird, their advanced technology representing decades of evolution in military aviation. The contrast was striking. One aircraft born from the crucible of World War II, the others representing the cutting edge of 21st century warfare. Rebecca's radio crackled to life as she reached the runway threshold. Colonel Harrison's voice cut through the static, cold and authoritative. He informed her that the F-35 demonstration team had been ordered to escort her flight, ostensibly for safety reasons. But Rebecca understood the real message. Harrison was making a show of force, surrounding her grandfather's plane with symbols of modern military might to emphasize his point about outdated heroes and their irrelevant legacies. As she lifted off, the F-35s moved into formation around her, their pilots maintaining radio silence. Rebecca felt dwarfed by the modern fighters, their presence both magnificent and menacing. The crowd below pointed and cheered, unaware of the psychological warfare being waged thousands of feet above their heads. Harrison's voice echoed across the airfield, beginning his planned commentary about the evolution of American air power and the lessons learned from past mistakes. Rebecca's heart pounded as she realized that Harrison intended to use this moment to destroy her grandfather's reputation in front of thousands of spectators. The F-35s tightened their formation, and she could see the pilots' helmets turning toward her aircraft. She wondered if they knew the truth about what was happening, or if they were simply following orders from a superior officer who had chosen spite over honor. The Mustang climbed steadily, its vintage engine working hard to keep pace with the modern jets. Rebecca could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders, not just her grandfather's legacy, but the legacy of every pilot who had ever faced down a bully in the sky. She thought about the young men who had climbed into similar cockpits 8 decades ago, knowing they might never return home, yet choosing to fly anyway because someone had to stand up for freedom. As the formation reached altitude, Rebecca prepared herself for whatever Harrison had planned. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. If he wanted to wage war on her family's honor, she would meet him in the sky, just as her grandfather had met his enemies over the Pacific so many years ago. The F-35s maintained their positions around her, silent sentinels in the desert sky. Rebecca wondered what their pilots were thinking, whether they understood that they were being used as weapons in a personal vendetta rather than protectors of American military tradition. She hoped that somewhere among them was a pilot who understood the true meaning of honor, someone who would recognize the injustice of Harrison's actions and choose to do what was right. Below them, The crowd continued to cheer, unaware that they were witnessing not just an air show, but a battle for the soul of military honor itself. Rebecca gripped her controls tighter and prepared for the fight of her life, knowing that her grandfather's spirit flew beside her in the thin desert air. The radio remained ominously quiet as they climbed higher, the F-35's formation tightening around her vintage fighter like a steel trap. Rebecca could sense the moment of truth approaching, when Harrison would make his move, and she would have to decide how far she was willing to go to defend her family's honor. The morning sun glinted off the Mustang's polished propeller as it carried her toward an uncertain fate, but Rebecca Mitchell had never been one to back down from a fight. Harrison's voice crackled through the radio again, this time addressing the crowd below. He began to tell the story of the P-51 Mustang, but Rebecca could hear the subtle venom in his tone as he prepared to reveal what he believed were the shameful secrets of her grandfather's service. The F-35s seemed to press closer, their modern weapons systems trained on her, as if she were an enemy combatant rather than a fellow American aviator. Rebecca closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the familiar vibration of the Merlin engine through her seat. When she opened them again, she was ready for whatever came next. The sky belonged to all pilots, regardless of when they had earned their wings, and she would not allow Harrison to corrupt that sacred space with his petty vengeance. Her grandfather's legacy would be defended, even if it meant facing down the most advanced fighters in the world with nothing but a 70-year-old warbird and an unshakable belief in the truth. The formation continued to climb, each aircraft carrying its own burden of history and expectation. Rebecca knew that the next few minutes would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of her grandfather's memory and the honor of every pilot who had ever flown in service of something greater than themselves. She was ready to fight for that honor, no matter the cost. Harrison's voice grew more confident as he prepared to deliver his devastating revelation about Captain Thomas Mitchell's supposed cowardice. The F-35s maintained their intimidating formation, their pilots still silent on the radio. Rebecca wondered if any of them questioned their orders, if any of them understood that they were being used as pawns in a personal vendetta rather than protectors of military tradition. The crowd below continued to cheer, their voices carrying faintly through the thin air. They had come to see a celebration of American aviation, but they were about to witness something far more complex and troubling. Rebecca steeled herself for the battle ahead, knowing that the next few moments would test everything she believed about courage, honor, and the price of standing up for what was right. As the formation reached its designated altitude, Rebecca felt a strange calm settle over her. She had done everything possible to prepare for this moment, and now it was time to face whatever Harrison had planned. The Mustang flew steady and true beneath her, its engine singing the same song of power and determination that had carried her grandfather through the darkest days of the war. The F-35s began to adjust their positions, and Rebecca realized that the moment of truth had finally arrived. Harrison was about to make his move, and she would have to decide how far she was willing to go to defend her family's honor. The morning sun climbed higher in the Nevada sky, casting long shadows across the desert below as the confrontation that had been building for days finally came to a head. Colonel Harrison's voice boomed across the airfield, his words carried by powerful speakers to thousands of spectators. Ladies and gentlemen, you're witnessing a remarkable demonstration of American air power, spanning 8 decades of innovation and courage. His tone carried a subtle edge that made Rebecca's stomach tighten. The P-51 Mustang you see below represents our nation's greatest generation of pilots, though not all of them lived up to the honor of their uniform. Rebecca's radio crackled with static as Harrison continued his commentary. She could see the crowd below, their faces turned upward, completely unaware of the psychological warfare being conducted in the sky above them. The F-35s maintained their formation around her, their sleek profiles cutting through the morning air with predatory grace. Captain Thomas Mitchell, the original pilot of this very aircraft, was court-martialed in 1945 for abandoning his formation during a critical mission over Japan. Harrison's voice carried clearly through the radio. While charges were eventually dropped due to wartime confusion, the incident raises important questions about the true nature of heroism and the myths we perpetuate about our military ancestors. Rebecca felt her blood boil as Harrison's words twisted the truth beyond recognition. She knew the real story. Her grandfather had broken formation to protect a damaged B-24 Liberator, guiding the wounded bomber and its crew to safety while under heavy enemy fire. 12 men had lived because of his actions, but Harrison was choosing to focus on the initial misunderstanding rather than the heroic reality. The F-35 formation leader's voice suddenly cut through the radio chatter, his call sign, Viper 1. His tone was professional but carried an undercurrent of tension. Control, this is Viper 1. We're maintaining formation with the Mustang as ordered, but I'm requesting clarification on our mission parameters. Harrison's response was sharp and immediate. Viper 1, you will maintain formation and provide escort for the demonstration. Any deviation from orders will result in immediate disciplinary action. Rebecca could sense the unease among the F-35 pilots. These were professional military aviators, not Harrison's personal enforcers, and she suspected they were beginning to question the true nature of their mission. She decided to take a risk and opened her own radio channel. "This is Mustang 1, she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. To the F-35 pilots maintaining formation with me, I want you to know that Colonel Harrison is using you as weapons in a personal vendetta. My grandfather, Captain Thomas Mitchell, was a hero who saved 12 lives during the war. The court-martial Harrison mentioned was based on a misunderstanding that was quickly resolved. Mustang 1, maintain radio silence immediately, Harrison barked through the channel. Any further unauthorized transmissions will result in immediate grounding. But Rebecca had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the F-35 pilots. She could see subtle changes in their formation, small adjustments that suggested they were beginning to question their orders. Professional military pilots were trained to think independently, to question orders that seemed questionable, and Harrison's use of them as intimidation tools was clearly making them uncomfortable. Viper One's voice came back over the radio, more cautious now. Control, we're professional aviators, not participants in personal disputes. I'm requesting a clear mission brief and justification for this escort formation. Harrison's anger was palpable through the radio static. Viper 1, you will follow orders without question. The safety of this airspace is your responsibility, and that includes containing any unauthorized maneuvers by the Mustang. Rebecca realized that Harrison was trying to paint her as a rogue pilot, someone who might pose a danger to the air show spectators. It was a clever manipulation, using the F-35's legitimate safety concerns to justify his harassment. But she also sensed that the modern pilots were too professional to be easily manipulated. The formation continued its flight pattern, while Harrison's commentary below grew more pointed. He began to describe the evolution of military accountability and the importance of learning from past mistakes. Each word was carefully chosen to undermine her grandfather's reputation, while maintaining plausible deniability about his true motives. Rebecca made a decision that would have made her grandfather proud. She began to perform a series of aerobatic maneuvers that had been part of her approved demonstration routine, but she executed them with a precision and grace that turned the Mustang into a living testament to the skill of its original pilot. The vintage fighter rolled and climbed, its movements painting poetry across the desert sky. The F-35 struggled to maintain formation during her aerobatic display, their pilots clearly impressed by her skill and the Mustang's performance. Rebecca could hear admiration creeping into their radio chatter, replacing the earlier tension with professional respect. "That's some impressive flying," Viper 2 commented, his voice carrying genuine appreciation. "The old bird's got moves." Harrison's voice cut through the radio again, sharp with frustration. "Viper formation, maintain escort positions. Do not engage in unauthorized commentary." But the damage was done. Rebecca had demonstrated her skill, and the Mustang's capabilities in a way that made Harrison's accusations seem petty and vindictive. The F-35 pilots were beginning to see her as a fellow aviator rather than a threat to be contained. As the formation completed another circuit of the airfield, Rebecca noticed something that made her heart race. One of the F-35s had moved slightly out of position, its pilot clearly trying to get a better look at her aircraft. She could see the pilot's helmet turning toward her, and she had the distinct impression that he was trying to read something painted on the Mustang's fuselage. The morning sun was hitting the aircraft at just the right angle to illuminate the faded nose art and squadron markings that Rebecca had so carefully restored. Anyone with knowledge of World War II aviation history would recognize the significance of those markings. They told the story of a pilot who had flown dozens of combat missions and had been decorated for valor on multiple occasions. Rebecca held her breath as the F-35 pilot maneuvered for a better view. She could see him adjusting his position, clearly trying to make out the details of the historical markings. The moment stretched on, filled with tension and possibility, as she waited to see if this modern warrior would recognize the truth about her grandfather's service. The radio crackled with static as the F-35 pilot processed what he was seeing. Rebecca could almost feel the weight of history bridging the gap between past and present, between her grandfather's war and the conflicts these modern pilots had faced. She wondered if the pilot examining her aircraft had seen combat himself, if he understood the weight of the decorations and mission marks painted on the Mustang's aluminum skin. Harrison's voice continued to echo across the airfield, his commentary becoming more aggressive as he sensed that his narrative was losing impact. The crowd below seemed restless, perhaps picking up on the tension in the sky above them. Rebecca knew that the next few minutes would determine whether truth or spite would prevail in this battle for her grandfather's honor. As the F-35 pilot completed his examination of the Mustang's markings, Rebecca felt a strange sense of anticipation. She had done everything possible to honor her grandfather's memory through the careful restoration of his aircraft. Now it was up to these modern pilots to decide whether they would stand with truth or allow themselves to be used as weapons in Harrison's personal war. The formation flew on through the bright Nevada morning, carrying with it the weight of 8 decades of military aviation history, and the hopes of one pilot determined to defend her family's honor against all odds. Viper 3's voice suddenly cut through the radio chatter, his tone carrying a note of awe that made Rebecca's heart skip. "Control, I'm looking at some interesting markings on the Mustang. This aircraft appears to have a significant combat history." Harrison's response was immediate and sharp. Viper 3, maintain formation and limit radio chatter to essential communications only. But Viper 3 continued, his voice growing more confident. Control, I'm seeing what appears to be 32 mission marks, a distinguished flying cross notation, and, wait, there's something else here. There was a pause as he adjusted his position for a better view. I'm seeing silver star markings and what looks like a rescue notation for a B-24 escort mission. Rebecca felt tears pricking her eyes as the modern pilot read the story written in faded paint on her grandfather's aircraft. Every mark, every decoration, every notation told the truth about Captain Thomas Mitchell's service, a truth that Harrison had tried to bury beneath bureaucratic accusations and half-truths. Viper One's voice joined the conversation, his tone respectful and professional. Control, if these markings are authentic, we're looking at the aircraft of a highly decorated combat veteran. The Silver Star was awarded for exceptional gallantry in action against an enemy force. Harrison's frustration was becoming evident in his voice. Viper formation. You are ordered to maintain formation and cease all unnecessary commentary. Your mission is escort, not historical analysis. But something had shifted in the dynamic between the F-35 pilots and their ground controller. Rebecca could sense it in the subtle changes in their formation, the way they seemed to be giving her more space, treating her aircraft with increased respect. The modern pilots were beginning to understand that they were escorting not just any vintage aircraft, but a piece of living history. Viper 2's voice came over the radio, quiet but clear. Ma'am, I'm seeing what appears to be a notation for October 15, 1944. Is that related to the Schweinfurt mission? Rebecca's voice caught in her throat as she responded. Negative, Viper 2. That notation is for the Leyte Gulf support mission. My grandfather's squadron provided air cover for the naval forces during the Philippines campaign. There was a moment of silence on the radio as the significance of her words sank in. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had been one of the largest naval engagements in history, and the pilots who had supported that operation had faced incredible dangers while helping to secure one of the most important victories of the Pacific War. Harrison's voice crackled through the radio again, his anger now barely contained. All aircraft return to base immediately. This demonstration is concluded. But Viper One's response surprised everyone. Control, we're still within our designated flight time and the airspace is clear. Unless there's a safety concern, we'd like to continue the escort mission as originally planned. Rebecca realized that the F-35 pilots were quietly rebelling against Harrison's orders, using their professional judgment to continue the flight despite his attempts to cut it short. They had seen the truth written on her grandfather's aircraft, and they were choosing to honor that truth rather than bow to the pressure of a vindictive officer. The formation continued its circuit of the airfield, But now the mood had completely changed. The F-35s flew with a dignity and respect that transformed them from intimidating enforcers into an honor guard for a piece of aviation history. Rebecca felt her grandfather's presence strongly in the cockpit, as if his spirit approved of the respect being shown by these modern warriors. Viper 3's voice came back over the radio, this time directed at Rebecca. Mustang 1, I'm seeing notation for a B-24 rescue mission on October 20th, 1944. Can you tell us about that? Rebecca's voice was steady as she responded, knowing that this was her chance to tell the truth about her grandfather's service. Viper 3, on that date, my grandfather broke formation to escort a damaged B-24 Liberator back to friendly territory. The bomber had been hit by enemy fire and was struggling to maintain altitude. My grandfather stayed with them for over 200 miles, fighting off 3 separate attacks by enemy fighters. The radio was quiet for a moment as the modern pilots processed this information. Rebecca could see them adjusting their positions slightly, giving her even more space and respect. Viper 1's voice carried a note of admiration. How many crew members were on that B-24? 12, Rebecca replied, her voice thick with emotion. All 12 made it home because my grandfather refused to abandon them. He was initially court-martialed because some officers thought he had deserted his primary formation. But when the full story came out, the charges were dropped and he was awarded the Silver Star for his actions. Harrison's voice cut through the radio again, desperate and angry. All aircraft return to base immediately. That is a direct order. But Viper 1's response was calm and professional. Control. We're escorting a highly decorated combat veterans aircraft as part of an air show demonstration. Unless you can provide a specific safety concern, we'll continue our mission as originally briefed. Rebecca realized that the F-35 pilots had made their choice. They were professional military aviators who understood the difference between legitimate orders and personal vendettas. They had seen the truth about her grandfather's service, and they were choosing to honor that truth rather than participate in Harrison's attempted character assassination. The formation continued its flight, but now it felt like a celebration rather than an intimidation tactic. The F-35s flew with precision and grace, their modern technology serving as a bridge between past and present, between her grandfather's generation of warriors and the current generation of military aviators. As they completed another circuit of the airfield, Rebecca noticed that the crowd below had grown silent, sensing that something significant was happening in the sky above them. The atmosphere had shifted from casual air show entertainment to something more profound and meaningful. Viper 2's voice came over the radio, his tone respectful and curious. Mustang 1, I'm honored to be flying with the granddaughter of Captain Thomas Mitchell. Would you be willing to tell us more about his service?" Rebecca felt a surge of pride and gratitude as she realized that these modern pilots wanted to hear her grandfather's story. They had seen through Harrison's lies and were choosing to honor the truth about a fellow warrior's service. "My grandfather flew 73 combat missions in the Pacific Theater," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the radio. "He was credited with shooting down 6 enemy aircraft and was involved in 17 bomber escort missions. But what made him special wasn't his kill count. It was his unwavering commitment to bringing everyone home." The F-35 pilots listened in respectful silence as Rebecca continued her grandfather's story. She told them about the time he had landed his damaged Mustang on a captured airfield to rescue a downed pilot, about the night mission when he had guided a lost formation home through terrible weather, and about the final mission when he had stayed behind to cover the evacuation of wounded soldiers while under heavy enemy fire. With each story, the formation seemed to fly with greater purpose and dignity. The F-35s had transformed from symbols of intimidation into an honor guard for a piece of living history, their modern technology serving as a tribute to the courage and sacrifice of an earlier generation. Harrison's voice had grown quiet on the radio, perhaps realizing that his plan had backfired spectacularly. The modern pilots had seen the truth about Captain Thomas Mitchell's service, and they were choosing to honor that truth rather than participate in a personal vendetta. As the formation prepared for its final approach to the airfield, Rebecca felt a profound sense of gratitude for these modern warriors who had chosen to stand with her grandfather's memory. They had seen past the bureaucratic accusations and political maneuvering to recognize the true character of a fellow pilot, a man who had risked everything to protect others. The morning sun climbed higher in the Nevada sky, casting long shadows across the desert as the unlikely formation of past and present continued its flight. Rebecca knew that her grandfather would have been proud of this moment, proud that his legacy was being honored by a new generation of pilots who understood the true meaning of military service. The radio crackled with static as the formation began its descent, but now the communications were filled with respect and camaraderie rather than tension and conflict. The F-35 pilots had made their choice, and they had chosen honor over politics, truth over convenience. As they approached the airfield, Rebecca could see the crowd below pointing and cheering, unaware of the profound drama that had just played out in the sky above them. What had begun as Harrison's attempt to humiliate her had transformed into a celebration of military aviation history and the bonds that connect warriors across generations. The formation touched down with precision and grace, the vintage Mustang leading the way as the modern F-35s followed in respectful formation. As they taxied toward the ramp, Rebecca felt her grandfather's presence strongly in the cockpit, as if his spirit approved of the respect being shown by these modern warriors. Harrison was waiting on the ramp as the aircraft shut down, his face flushed with anger and frustration. But he was no longer the intimidating figure he had been that morning. The F-35 pilots had seen the truth about Captain Thomas Mitchell's service, and they had chosen to honor that truth rather than participate in a personal vendetta. As Rebecca climbed out of the Mustang's cockpit, she was surprised to see the F-35 pilots approaching her aircraft with obvious respect and interest. They had removed their helmets and were examining the historical markings with the reverence of military historians rather than the casual curiosity of tourists. Viper 1, whose name tag read Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Rodriguez, approached Rebecca with a respectful nod. "Ma'am, it was an honor to fly with your grandfather's aircraft today. The markings on this plane tell the story of a true American hero." Rebecca felt tears threatening as she shook Rodriguez's hand. "Thank you, Colonel. Your support today means more to me than you can know." Viper 2, Captain Sarah Williams, joined the conversation. "Ma'am, I've studied World War II aviation history extensively, and the missions your grandfather flew were legendary. The B-24 rescue mission alone deserves to be remembered and honored." Even Viper 3, a young lieutenant whose name tag read David Chen, approached with obvious respect. "Ma'am, I'm just beginning my career in military aviation, but I hope I can serve with the same honor and courage your grandfather showed." Harrison attempted to reassert his authority, approaching the group with obvious frustration. "Pilots, you were ordered to return to base immediately. Your continued participation in this demonstration was unauthorized." But Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez turned to face Harrison with the calm confidence of a professional military officer. "Colonel, we completed our mission as briefed. We provided escort for a historically significant aircraft during an air show demonstration. At no point did we receive any legitimate safety concerns that would have justified cutting the mission short." Harrison's face grew redder as he realized that his intimidation tactics had failed completely. "You were ordered to maintain formation and limit radio chatter. Your discussion of historical markings was unauthorized." Captain Williams stepped forward, her voice respectful but firm. "Colonel, as military aviators, we have a responsibility to understand and honor the history of our profession. When we encountered aircraft markings that indicated significant combat service, it was appropriate to acknowledge that service with the respect it deserved." Rebecca watched the confrontation with growing amazement. The F-35 pilots were not just defending her grandfather's honor. They were defending their own professional integrity against an officer who had tried to use them as weapons in a personal vendetta. Young Lieutenant Chen added his voice to the discussion. "Colonel, the aircraft we escorted today bears the markings of a Silver Star recipient and a pilot who saved 12 lives during combat operations. As military officers, we have a duty to honor such service regardless of any personal conflicts that may exist." Harrison realized that he was facing a united front of professional military aviators who had seen through his manipulation and chosen to stand with the truth. His carefully planned humiliation had backfired spectacularly, transforming from an attack on Rebecca's family into a celebration of military aviation history. The crowd of air show spectators had begun to gather around the aircraft, drawn by the obvious respect being shown to the vintage Mustang by the modern F-35 pilots. Word was spreading through the crowd about the historical significance of the restored warbird and the stories it carried. An elderly man in a World War II veteran's cap approached the group, his eyes fixed on the Mustang with obvious emotion. "Is this really Tom Mitchell's airplane?" he asked, his voice shaking with age and feeling. Rebecca turned to the veteran with surprise. "You knew my grandfather." The old man nodded slowly. "I was a B-24 tail gunner. Tom Mitchell saved my life on October 20th, 1944. I was on the bomber he escorted home when we got shot up over the Philippines. He stayed with us for over 200 miles, fighting off enemy fighters the whole way." A hush fell over the gathered crowd as the veteran continued his story. "When we got back to base, Tom was in more trouble than we were. Some desk jockey wanted to court-martial him for leaving formation, but every man on my crew testified about what he did for us. He was a hero, plain and simple." Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to the first-hand account of her grandfather's courage. This was the truth that Harrison had tried to suppress, the reality of a man who had put the lives of others before his own career and safety. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of his rank. "Colonel Harrison, I think we need to discuss the nature of this morning's mission and the appropriateness of using military aircraft for personal vendettas." Harrison's face had gone pale as he realized that his carefully planned revenge had collapsed completely. The F-35 pilots were not just defending Rebecca's grandfather. They were questioning his own conduct and integrity as a military officer. The crowd continued to grow as more air show spectators gathered around the Mustang, drawn by the emotional scene playing out before them. Many of them were taking photos and videos, documenting the moment when modern military pilots honored the legacy of a World War II hero. Captain Williams approached Rebecca with a thoughtful expression. "Ma'am, would you be willing to tell us more about your grandfather's service? I think there are a lot of people here who would benefit from hearing his story." Rebecca looked around at the gathering crowd, seeing faces filled with interest and respect. These people had come to see an air show, but they were witnessing something far more meaningful: the passing of military tradition from one generation to the next. "My grandfather always said that the most important thing about being a pilot wasn't the glory or the recognition," Rebecca began, her voice carrying clearly across the group. "It was the responsibility to protect the people who depended on you, whether they were your wingman, your formation, or the soldiers on the ground." The crowd listened in respectful silence as Rebecca continued her grandfather's story, describing his philosophy of service and his commitment to bringing everyone home. She told them about the letters he had written to the families of pilots who hadn't made it back, about the care packages he had sent to wounded comrades, and about the quiet way he had mentored younger pilots throughout his career. As she spoke, Rebecca noticed that Harrison had quietly slipped away from the group, perhaps realizing that his presence was no longer welcome. The F-35 pilots remained, their respectful attention serving as a bridge between past and present, between her grandfather's generation of warriors and the current generation of military aviators. The morning sun climbed higher in the Nevada sky, casting warm light across the restored Mustang, and the crowd gathered around it. What had begun as Harrison's attempt to humiliate Rebecca had transformed into a celebration of military service and the bonds that connect warriors across generations. As the impromptu gathering began to disperse, Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez approached Rebecca with a thoughtful expression. "Ma'am, I'd like to make a formal request. Would you be willing to bring your grandfather's aircraft to our base for a squadron presentation? I think our pilots would benefit from hearing about his service and the lessons he learned." Rebecca felt a surge of pride and gratitude as she realized that her grandfather's legacy would continue to inspire and educate future generations of military aviators. "I would be honored, Colonel. I think my grandfather would have liked that." Captain Williams joined the conversation. "Ma'am, I'm also wondering if you would be willing to work with our squadron historians to document your grandfather's service. Stories like his deserve to be preserved and shared with future pilots." Rebecca nodded enthusiastically. "I have boxes of his letters, photographs, and mission reports. I'd be happy to share them with anyone who's interested in learning about his service." As the F-35 pilots prepared to depart, each of them took a moment to examine the Mustang more closely. studying the historical markings and asking questions about specific missions and decorations. Their respect and interest served as a powerful validation of Rebecca's efforts to preserve her grandfather's memory. Lieutenant Chen approached Rebecca with obvious emotion. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for sharing your grandfather's story. As a new pilot, I sometimes wonder if I'll be able to live up to the standards set by previous generations. Hearing about his service reminds me of what it really means to be a military aviator." Rebecca smiled at the young pilot. "Lieutenant, the fact that you're thinking about those standards means you're already on the right path. My grandfather always said that the best pilots are the ones who understand their responsibility to others." As the morning progressed, word of the confrontation and its resolution spread throughout the air show community. Rebecca found herself approached by other pilots, mechanics, and aviation enthusiasts who wanted to hear about her grandfather's service and see the restored Mustang. The aircraft itself seemed to glow in the desert sunlight, its carefully restored aluminum skin reflecting the respect and admiration of everyone who approached it. Every rivet, every wire, every component told the story of a man who had served with honor and courage, and Rebecca felt proud that she had been able to preserve and share that story. As the air show continued around them, Rebecca realized that her grandfather's legacy was secure. The modern F-35 pilots had seen the truth about his service, and they had chosen to honor that truth rather than participate in Harrison's personal vendetta. The bonds between warriors that transcended generations had proven stronger than petty politics and personal spite. The vintage Mustang sat quietly on the ramp, its engine cooling in the desert heat, but its spirit remained strong. The aircraft had carried its message across the decades, connecting past and present in a way that no amount of bureaucratic maneuvering could diminish. Rebecca looked up at the clear Nevada sky, knowing that her grandfather would have been proud of this moment. His legacy lived on not just in the restored aircraft, but in the respect and admiration of a new generation of pilots who understood the true meaning of military service. Colonel Harrison's attempt to destroy her family's honor had failed completely, transformed instead into a celebration of military aviation history and the values that connect warriors across generations. The F-35 pilots had seen the truth written in faded paint on her grandfather's aircraft, and they had chosen to honor that truth with the respect it deserved. As the afternoon wore on, Rebecca found herself surrounded by a growing circle of admirers who wanted to hear more about her grandfather's service. Veterans from multiple conflicts shared their own stories, creating an impromptu gathering that celebrated the continuity of military service across generations. An elderly woman approached the group, her eyes filled with tears as she looked at the Mustang. My brother flew P-51s in Europe, she said quietly. He didn't make it home, but seeing this beautiful aircraft makes me feel like a part of him is still here. Rebecca took the woman's hand gently. Ma'am, every time we remember their service, every time we honor their sacrifice, a part of them lives on. This aircraft is a tribute to all of them, the ones who came home and the ones who didn't. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Rebecca realized that her grandfather's story had become a catalyst for something larger. People were sharing memories of their own family members who had served, creating connections between past and present that transcended individual stories. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez approached Rebecca as the crowd began to thin. Ma'am, I've been thinking about what happened today. Colonel Harrison's actions were completely inappropriate, and I want you to know that we'll be filing a formal complaint about his conduct. Rebecca shook her head. Colonel, I appreciate your support, but I don't need you to fight my battles for me. What happened today was more powerful than any formal complaint could be. The truth about my grandfather's service spoke for itself. Rodriguez nodded with respect. You're right, ma'am. But as military officers, we have a responsibility to ensure that our profession maintains its integrity. What Harrison did today was a betrayal of everything we stand for. Captain Williams joined the conversation. Ma'am, I've been in contact with our squadron historian. We'd like to formally document your grandfather's service and include it in our heritage room. Would you be willing to work with us on that project? Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude. I would be honored, Captain. I have extensive documentation of his service, including his personal letters and mission reports. I'd be happy to share them with your historian. As the F-35 pilots prepared to depart, each of them took a moment to examine the Mustang one final time. Their respect and interest served as a powerful validation of Rebecca's efforts to preserve her grandfather's memory and honor his service. Young Lieutenant Chen approached Rebecca with obvious emotion. Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for what you did today. You showed us what it means to stand up for what's right, even when facing overwhelming odds. That's a lesson I'll carry with me throughout my career. Rebecca smiled at the young pilot. Lieutenant, the fact that you understand that lesson means you're already following in the footsteps of great pilots like my grandfather. The most important thing is to remember that we serve something greater than ourselves. As the afternoon progressed, Rebecca found herself approached by members of the media who had heard about the morning's events. She carefully told her grandfather's story, emphasizing his courage and sacrifice while avoiding any direct criticism of Harrison's conduct. The story began to spread through social media and aviation forums, with people sharing photos and videos of the restored Mustang and the respectful escort provided by the F-35 pilots. The narrative that emerged was one of honor, respect, and the bonds that connect military aviators across generations. Rebecca realized that her grandfather's legacy was now secure in a way that no amount of bureaucratic maneuvering could threaten. The modern F-35 pilots had seen the truth about his service, and they had chosen to honor that truth with the respect it deserved. As the sun began to set over the Nevada desert, Rebecca prepared the Mustang for its flight home. The aircraft had served its purpose, carrying its message across the decades and connecting past and present in a way that honored the best traditions of military aviation. She performed her pre-flight inspection with particular care, checking every system and component with the reverence of someone who understood that she was not just maintaining an aircraft, but preserving a piece of history. The engine turned over smoothly, its familiar rumble carrying the same power and determination that had carried her grandfather through the darkest days of the war. As Rebecca taxied toward the runway, she could see the F-35 pilots standing near their aircraft, watching her departure with obvious respect. They had transformed from intimidating enforcers into an honor guard for a piece of living history, their modern technology serving as a bridge between past and present. The Mustang lifted off into the desert sky, its engine singing the same song of power and courage that had carried her grandfather through 73 combat missions. Rebecca felt his presence strongly in the cockpit, as if his spirit approved of the day's events and the respect that had been shown to his memory. As she climbed away from the airfield, Rebecca reflected on the morning's events. What had begun as Harrison's attempt to humiliate her had transformed into a celebration of military aviation history and the values that connect warriors across generations. The F-35 pilots had seen the truth written in faded paint on her grandfather's aircraft, and they had chosen to honor that truth rather than participate in a personal vendetta. The desert landscape passed beneath the Mustang's wings, unchanged from the terrain that had witnessed countless training flights during World War II. Rebecca imagined her grandfather flying similar routes, preparing for the missions that would take him halfway around the world to face an enemy determined to destroy everything he held dear. As the flight progressed, Rebecca's radio crackled with messages from other pilots who had heard about the morning's events. Word was spreading through the aviation community about the confrontation and its resolution, with people expressing admiration for her courage and respect for her grandfather's service. She responded to each message with grace and humility, always emphasizing her grandfather's service rather than her own actions. The story was not about her victory over Harrison, but about the enduring power of truth and the bonds that connect military aviators across generations. As the Mustang approached its home airfield, Rebecca felt a profound sense of satisfaction and peace. Her grandfather's legacy was secure, preserved not just in the restored aircraft, but in the respect and admiration of a new generation of pilots who understood the true meaning of military service. The vintage fighter touched down with the same grace and precision that had characterized her grandfather's flying, its wheels kissing the runway with barely a sound. As Rebecca taxied toward her hangar, she could see a small crowd of people waiting to welcome her home. Among them were several local veterans who had heard about the morning's events and wanted to pay their respects to her grandfather's memory. Their presence served as a reminder that the bonds between warriors extended far beyond individual services or generations, encompassing all who had served in defense of freedom. As Rebecca shut down the engine and climbed out of the cockpit, she was surprised to find her elderly neighbor, Mr. Peterson, waiting with tears in his eyes. He had served as a tail gunner on B-17s in Europe and had never forgotten the P-51 pilots who had escorted his formation through dangerous skis. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "I heard about what happened today. Your grandfather would have been proud of you and proud of those young pilots who stood up for his honor." Rebecca hugged the elderly veteran, feeling the weight of history and tradition in his frail shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. It means everything to know that his service is remembered and honored." As the small crowd dispersed, Rebecca stood alone with the Mustang in the quiet hangar. The aircraft seemed to glow in the soft light, its carefully restored aluminum skin reflecting the respect and admiration of everyone who had encountered it that day. She thought about her grandfather's final letter to her grandmother, written just days before his death in a training accident in 1946. In it, he had written about the importance of standing up for what was right, even when the world seemed determined to tear you down. Today, Rebecca had lived up to that standard, defending his honor against all odds. The restoration project had taken 3 years of her life, but it had been worth every hour of work. The aircraft had served its purpose, carrying its message across the decades and connecting past and present in a way that honored the best traditions of military aviation. As Rebecca locked the hangar and prepared to head home, she reflected on the morning's events one final time. Harrison's attempt to destroy her family's honor had failed completely, transformed instead into a celebration of military aviation history and the values that connect warriors across generations. The F-35 pilots had seen the truth written in faded paint on her grandfather's aircraft, and they had chosen to honor that truth with the respect it deserved. Their actions had validated everything Rebecca believed about the character of military aviators and the bonds that transcend individual conflicts and personal vendettas. As she drove home through the Nevada desert, Rebecca could see the stars beginning to appear in the clear sky. She imagined her grandfather flying similar routes 8 decades earlier, guided by the same constellations as he prepared for missions that would take him halfway around the world. The legacy carved in the Mustang's aluminum skin was secure now, preserved not just in the restored aircraft, but in the respect and admiration of a new generation of pilots who understood the true meaning of military service. The morning's confrontation had ended not with victory or defeat, but with truth and honor prevailing over spite and personal vendetta. Rebecca smiled as she thought about the young lieutenant who had thanked her for showing him what it meant to stand up for what was right. The cycle of mentorship and inspiration that had begun with her grandfather's service would continue with each new generation of pilots who encountered his story. The desert night was peaceful and quiet, broken only by the distant sound of aircraft engines as other pilots returned from their own flights. Rebecca felt a profound sense of connection to all of them, past, present, and future, bound together by their shared commitment to something greater than themselves. As she pulled into her driveway, Rebecca realized that her grandfather's legacy would continue to inspire and educate future generations of military aviators. The F-35 pilots had seen the truth about his service, and they had chosen to honor that truth rather than participate in Harrison's personal vendetta. The morning's events had proven that the bonds between warriors transcend individual conflicts and personal differences. When faced with a choice between truth and spite, between honor and revenge, the modern pilots had chosen the path that honored the best traditions of military aviation. Rebecca entered her house and went directly to her grandfather's desk, where she kept his letters and mission reports. She pulled out his final letter to her grandmother, reading once again the words that had inspired her to defend his honor against all odds. "The most important thing about being a pilot," he had written, "is not the glory or the recognition, but the responsibility to protect the people who depend on you. Whether they are your wingman, your formation, or the soldiers on the ground, you must be willing to sacrifice everything to bring them home safely." Those words had guided Rebecca through the morning's confrontation, giving her the strength to stand up to Harrison's intimidation and defend her grandfather's honor. They would continue to guide her as she worked to preserve his legacy for future generations. As she prepared for bed, Rebecca could hear the distant sound of aircraft engines in the night sky. She imagined the F-35 pilots returning to their base, carrying with them the story of Captain Thomas Mitchell and the lessons his service had taught them about courage, honor, and the true meaning of military aviation. The Mustang sat quietly in its hangar, its engine cooling in the desert air, but its spirit remained strong. The aircraft had carried its message across the decades, connecting past and present in a way that no amount of bureaucratic maneuvering could diminish. Rebecca closed her eyes and felt her grandfather's presence strongly in the room, as if his spirit approved of the day's events and the respect that had been shown to his memory. His legacy was secure now, preserved not just in the restored aircraft, but in the hearts and minds of a new generation of pilots who understood the true meaning of military service. The confrontation with Harrison had ended not with victory or defeat, but with truth and honor prevailing over spite and personal vendetta. The F-35 pilots had seen the legacy carved in the Mustang's aluminum skin, and they had chosen to honor that legacy with the respect it deserved. As Rebecca drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of clear skies and distant horizons, of young pilots learning about courage and sacrifice from the stories of those who had flown before them. The cycle of mentorship and inspiration that had begun with her grandfather's service would continue with each new generation of aviators who encountered his story. The desert night was peaceful and quiet, broken only by the distant sound of aircraft engines as other pilots continued their own journeys through the sky. Rebecca felt a profound sense of connection to all of them, past, present, and future, bound together by their shared commitment to something greater than themselves. In the morning, there would be new flights, new challenges, and new opportunities to honor the legacy of those who had served before. But tonight, Rebecca Mitchell slept peacefully, knowing that her grandfather's honor was secure and that his legacy would continue to inspire future generations of military aviators. The story of Captain Thomas Mitchell and his granddaughter's defense of his honor would be told and retold in squadron-ready rooms and aviation museums, serving as a reminder that the bonds between warriors transcend individual conflicts and personal differences. When faced with a choice between truth and spite, between honor and revenge, the best of humanity's warriors will always choose the path that honors the finest traditions of military service. The Mustang's engine was silent now, but its message continued to echo through the desert night, carried on the wings of modern fighters whose pilots understood that they were part of something larger than themselves. The legacy carved in aluminum and written in the stars would endure, passed from one generation of pilots to the next, ensuring that the courage and sacrifice of heroes like Captain Thomas Mitchell would never be forgotten. As the night deepened over the Nevada desert, Rebecca Mitchell's grandfather's spirit soared with the knowledge that his legacy was secure, preserved not just in the restored aircraft, but in the respect and admiration of warriors who understood the true meaning of honor. The confrontation was over, but the story would continue, inspiring future generations to stand up for what was right, even when facing overwhelming odds. The F-35 pilots had seen the truth written in faded paint on a vintage fighter, and they had chosen to honor that truth rather than participate in a personal vendetta. Their actions had validated everything Rebecca believed about the character of military aviators and the bonds that transcend individual conflicts and personal differences. In the end, Colonel Harrison's attempt to destroy her family's honor had failed completely, transformed instead into a celebration of military aviation history and the values that connect warriors across generations. The legacy carved in her grandfather's armor had spoken for itself, whispering its truth to those who had the wisdom to listen and the courage to stand up for what was right. The morning sun would rise again over the Nevada desert, bringing new opportunities to honor the legacy of those who had served before. But tonight, the desert was quiet and peaceful, watched over by the spirits of warriors past and present, united in their shared commitment to something greater than themselves. Rebecca Mitchell's defense of her grandfather's honor had ended not with victory or defeat, but with truth and honor prevailing over spite and personal vendetta. The F-35 pilots had seen the legacy carved in the Mustang's aluminum skin, and they had chosen to honor that legacy with the respect it deserved. The story would continue, passed from one generation of pilots to the next, ensuring that the courage and sacrifice of heroes like Captain Thomas Mitchell would never be forgotten. The bonds between warriors that transcend individual conflicts and personal differences had proven stronger than petty politics and personal spite, and the legacy of honor would endure as long as there were pilots willing to defend it. As the stars wheeled overhead in the clear desert sky, Rebecca Mitchell slept peacefully, knowing that her grandfather's honor was secure and that his legacy would continue to inspire future generations of military aviators. The confrontation was over, but the story would live on, carved not just in aluminum but in the hearts and minds of those who understood the true meaning of courage, honor, and sacrifice.